Coming into video games in the late 70s and early 80s, the arcade was a huge part of my experience with the hobby. I remember the utter excitement of walking into an arcade and seeing and hearing the unforgettable sights and sounds of all that electronic beauty at play. So fascinated and impressed was I with arcade gaming that home consoles would actually let me down to such a degree that I simply didn't want to play cut-down versions of the games I loved. Systems like the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, and the ColecoVision hold no nostalgic value with me. It was the arcade or nothing back then, and Sega would quickly become my go-to company for the best games. I had seen the likes of Pac-Man and Space Invaders completely dominate the arcade scene for years, and I had played my fair share of their brand of fun. But literally out of nowhere, Sega would take video games from simple little characters running around a single screen and turn them into full-blown spectacles loaded with visual pizzazz. Sega had been around for years, of course, with their name plastered across a number of arcade games that never really caught much of my attention. But all that changed in 1983, when their newly released Buck Rogers Planet of Zoom arrived at my local arcade. This was the first time I had really paid the name Sega much mind, but wow, Buck Rogers blew me away visually. I had never really seen a game move like this. Enemies would fly in and out of the action so smoothly, and it even played fairly well. Around that same time I found a game called Zaxxon, an isometric shoot-'em-up that looked 3D in its own way. I had again never seen a game move or play like this, and Sega all of a sudden was on my radar for names to look for whenever I wandered in to the arcade with a few bucks in my pocket. Nothing could prepare me for what was about to hit, however. In 1985, I rolled up on Sega's new motorcycle racing game Hang On, and oh my god did it blow me away. I had never seen anything so smooth. I mean, it moved faster and with a more convincing 3D effect than I had ever seen before. It played incredible too, and I was in love with Sega's new offering. Sega wasn't done in '85 though, and I again walked into my arcade only to find yet another game that just blew me away visually. Space Harrier had all the awesome smooth scaling that Hang On did, but was now in the mold of a fantasy shooter, with all manner of monsters and machines flying at you. It was the kind of game that simply had no equal in regards to presentation, and just like that, Sega had rapidly become my favorite arcade game maker. '86 would usher in more Sega arcade goodness, and they would flex their might with the shoot-'em-up genre in the form of Fantasy Zone. The colorful graphics, smooth scrolling, unique gameplay, and on-the-fly upgrade system made this one a great introduction for me to what would become known as Cute-'em-ups. Sega wasn't done with blowing me away with its pseudo 3D effects, however, and '86 would also bring Outrun. Again, the smooth scaling graphics and speed just floored me, and it impressed me equally with its impeccable soundtrack. It also had branching paths that kept you playing to see what was next, a gameplay innovation that took it well beyond the linear experiences of years past. The arcade success Sega had seen in '85 and '86 gave way to an explosion of releases in 1987. Afterburner would show up and once again do Sega's sprite scaling technology justice, and was their fastest game yet. Like Outrun, it was accompanied by an incredible music score that drove the adrenaline-filled gameplay perfectly. Alien Syndrome showed up in '87 too, providing a great break from the superscalers in the form of an overhead run-and-gun, where you had to save your friends from aliens. It had great power-ups and had co-op multiplayer to boot. '87 would also bring Sega's awesome Shinobi arcade game to light, a side-scrolling ninja action game loaded with challenge and great gameplay. It was a great example of Sega showing incredible range by covering multiple genres with a consistent quality that was heads and tails above anything else I was finding from their competition. 1987 wasn't done with Shinobi, oh no, and Sega would release Super Hang-On, an upgrade to their previous motorcycle effort. It had more tracks to choose from, and holy hell did they upgrade the musical score. It still had that same great gameplay though, making it the definitive version to play. But it was 1987's Thunderblade that absolutely floored me. This technically astounding shooter absolutely blew anything else in the arcade away visually at the time. There was simply no comparison. Even Sega's other sprite scaling games paled next to it. There was so much more on screen, and the mixed gameplay of third-person and overhead game styles gave the game a truly unique feel. 1987 had been another incredible year for Sega, cementing the company as my favorite arcade manufacturer by a mile. As good as 1987 had been, 1988 would prove to be even better. We'd see Altered Beast, the two-player co-op action game with impressive graphics and gameplay centered on morphing into superpowered creatures. 88 would also see the much less graphically impressive Gain Ground. Compared to Sega's other efforts, its presentation left a lot to be desired, yet it played no less great. You'd need to fight your way through a playfield loaded with enemies and get your team to safety on the other side. Almost as if answering my request to step back up the graphical tour de force offerings, Sega would do just that with 1988's Galaxy Force 2. For as great as all their previous superscalers had been, Galaxy Force 2 absolutely destroyed them all visually. I had never seen anything like this. It played sorta like a cross between Afterburner and Space Harrier, and had both indoor and outdoor play areas. It set the bar for arcade gaming graphics to a level that would take years to fully beat, taking years more before we actually had home hardware that could replicate it competently. Hot on its heels and providing its own impressive graphical style was Power Drift, a kart racer that felt more like a roller coaster ride than a racing game. It too played great, and was yet another Sega arcade experience that looked like nothing else on the market. As 1988 would come to a close, it was clear that Sega was taking up the majority of my attention in the arcade. I had come to expect nothing less than a stellar experience every single time I'd see a new game from Sega, and this consistency had endeared the company to me to a degree that I can honestly say put them well above all other game makers combined. Sega quite simply was in another class all its own.
Final
1989 would bring about even more variety in Sega's arcade releases. Cyber Police eSWAT was a co-op action game that had futuristic cops doing battle in exoskeletons. The first few stages were just you running around with a pea shooter, but you were soon loaded with armor, special weapons, and machine guns that could cut down your foes much faster. Although using similar assets, it was a very different game from the home version released on the Sega Genesis. 1988 would also see the co-op multiplayer fantasy hack-and-slash action game, Golden Axe. Rocking an unforgettable soundtrack and impressive screen-filling magic attacks, me and my friends spent countless quarters trying to defeat that evil bastard Death Adder. The superscalar goodness would continue in '89 with the release of Racing Hero, a motorcycle racing game that played and looked great. It had a camera view that was pulled in much closer than some of Sega's other racing games, giving it a unique feel and gameplay angle. '89 would also see the direct sequel to Shinobi released, called Shadow Dancer. It played very similar to Shinobi, but added new bonus stages, a K9 companion that could help you attack enemies, and even more challenge. Like eSWAT, it was a very different game from the home port that the Genesis would get, a fact that is applauded by some and jeered by others. Turbo Outrun showed up in 1989 as well. Although similar to the game in which it draws its namesake, this one would be quite a bit more dynamic, with weather effects like rain and snow affecting driving conditions to varying degrees. You also had cops to deal with, and a new turbo button that would give big bursts of speed at opportune times. 1989 would close out for me with Wrestle War, a one-on-one wrestling game that had very nice gameplay. You would face a roster of personalities that had different styles and finishing moves to contend with. Battles could be taken ringside, and you could even use the dreaded foreign object to gain advantages. It was hard as hell, but a really good time.
1, 2, 3.
Sega would of course release many other arcade games during the 80s than I'm showing you here, but these were the games that turned Sega from a mild curiosity to a beloved company for me. The consistency of quality, the unique graphical presentations that always pushed the definition of great visuals, the unforgettable music that accompanied many of its releases, and the sheer volume of it all, made Sega the undisputed king of the arcade. So powerfully designed were some of these releases, it would take an additional decade or more for a home version to live up to its quality. Many other companies made many other unforgettable games in the arcade in the 1980s, but when it comes to the standard bearer that never settled on simply following other companies' trends, there was Sega alone at the top of the heap.